It is really lovely to be with you here today. One of the great benefits of the work that I now have at the College of Social Justice is the opportunity to travel to our congregations really all around the country and gather with people I don't know, but who are part of my kin and my family in worship. And I have found, as perhaps many of you have found this year in particular, that I need that more than I have perhaps needed it before. We are all struggling, I think, to make sense of the sort of endless string of crises that seem to be coming at us anytime we tune into the news. Some of them political, many of them political, some of them physical crises, as with the hurricanes or with the fires here in California. In difficult times, it is especially good to be together, to gather ourselves in community with some silence and some music and some moments of calm, some time for remembering what matters most to us. Any little space for recollection is precious. We are in the midst of a long, hard season in our country, for our communities, and especially for already targeted groups, immigrants, people of color, Muslims. The divisions across our country have become excruciatingly stark and obvious, but they rest on foundations that have been laid during the course of years. And so the contentiousness is not going to go away anytime soon. And though many things could certainly be said about the state of our union, one of the truest, I think, it was contained in our reading in those words from Mother Teresa. We have forgotten that we belong to each other. One of our great tasks now is to remember and to help other people remember that we do, in fact, belong to and with each other, and also to remember how large, how ample our sense of kinship is really meant to be. Remember. Remember is a really marvelous word. The Latin roots mean to intensively bring back to mind. But the word member also, of course, means to be part of, as to be the member of a congregation. And so the act of remembering is one of recollection, but not only of something to our consciousness, also of us to one another, to each other. Our houses of worship, across all of their diversity, all houses of worship, are actually meant to be places of recollection. They are places we come to be reminded of what matters most. When we feel bombarded by difficult news during the course of any given day, our attention gets pulled in so many directions, and our emotions as well feel so jerked around that we can feel exhausted and helpless and feel like just shutting down. Our churches are meant to be places to wake us up again and to help us, to sustain us in staying awake. We give ourselves to them, not because any of us need one more thing to do, especially on a weekend, but because we know that here, at least some of the time, something happens that calls us to attend again to what really matters. Some shift of perspective, some little ringing of the heart's bell that helps us stay awake in the way we want to be awake to our lives. In the little quote in your order of service is taken from a book called Resistance by Barry Lopez, and in that he writes, "Human beings are creatures in search of proportion in life, a pattern of grace. It is balance and beauty we want, not triumph. But we have an appetite for distraction, a tendency toward forgetfulness. We forget what we want to mean." I love that framing, that we forget what we want to mean, not what we want to mean when we're speaking, but what we want our lives to mean. We have an appetite for distraction. But we also have a deep hunger to be of use, to stand up against injustice, to relieve suffering, to have the words come forth from us in kindness, not in fury. We want to mean something as we hurtle along in these little lives of ours. The UU College of Social Justice, which I am privileged to serve as director, is designed to help us within our denomination in that aspiration toward what we want to mean. It was founded, as you heard from Nika, by both of the large institutions of our faith, the UUA and the UU Service Committee, to create programs that would serve justice in our movement in two key ways. The first way is by creating programs of experiential learning. And that's based on the idea that the kind of learning that can sometimes literally change our lives comes to us usually not through books or films or lectures or sermons, but through some kind of direct encounter with a part of our world's reality we had not known before. And the second premise for all of the programs of the College of Social Justice is that they should be grounded spiritually within the key tenets of our faith, within the key core teachings of Unitarian Universalism. And though we have a tremendous amount of diversity of belief within our fold, there are a few bone-deep elements in Unitarian Universalism on which all of our fold agree across all our diversity around the country and around the world. And these are the core tenets on which the College of Social Justice programs are founded. They are the same core truths that we are all called to hold front and center in these fraught days of such division in our politics in particular. They form the heart, I believe, of what we must remember together. The first of these is the truth that our faith teaches about our interdependence, not only with one another or with people of our country or culture or class or color, but with all people and with the earth itself. We capture that idea with a visual image of the interdependent web, which is an easy thing for us to conjure in our mind's eye because we know what those perfect morning spider webs look like from orb spiders with the dew on them and the sun shining on them before anything has torn them at all. So it's easy to envision the web of our interconnection. But the teaching of our faith about our interconnection is more complex than that physical, familiar web. And it is not always bright or shining. There are difficult questions that lie along its sometimes tangled strands. One of the best ways that I ever heard those questions, or at least some of them articulated, is from a liberation theologian from Latin America named Gustavo Gutierrez. Gutierrez taught in a sermon that I heard many years ago that the two most important questions that people of faith or goodwill can ever ask ourselves are contained in the original story of creation that's held in the Hebrew scriptures. It's the part of the story, that ancient myth of creation, that recounts the first act of human violence when Cain murders his brother Abel and then runs off to hide in fear and confusion. God comes looking for him and, walking through the garden, asks those two questions. First, where are you? And second, where is your brother? Gutierrez taught that those same two questions are falling into our awareness all the time, like invisible rain. Where are you? Where are we? In the matrix of privilege and power, what grace and what gifts have come to us purely through an accident of birth? And then, where are our siblings, who are so often caught on the raw side of that same equation of privilege and power? What damage has come to them based on an accident of birth? Where are we? Where are our siblings? Attending well to those two questions is not an easy practice. Asking them with real attention can make us deeply uncomfortable, and yet they form the core of the calling of that first teaching of our faith, our interdependence. Not long ago, I helped lead a delegation, a group, on one of our experiential learning journeys to the border with Arizona and Mexico near Tucson and then Nogales, primarily for ministers and for religious educators and seminarians. And on that particular journey, as with most of our border witness journeys, one of the great realizations that people have that is often a shock for them is the mortal consequence of current U.S. policy there. Within the Arizona desert, every year, several hundred bodies are pulled from the desert, several hundred. So there are these mortal consequences, and the realization of that hits people very hard when they go on one of these journeys. One of the things we do is walk some of the migrant trails in the desert. And at the end of this particular immersion journey, as we were closing and talking with each other about what we would be taking home from the experience, we had a little ceremony with an altar in the middle of our circle on which we had put pebbles gleaned from that desert walk along the migrant trails. We invited each person to take a pebble from the altar and to speak a word or two about what they took with them as they returned home from this experience. One of my colleagues, when it was his turn, did something I had never seen before. He got up and took his pebble, and then he sat back down, took the shoe off his foot, put the pebble in it, and then put it back on his foot. And he said, "These days that we have spent together have been eye-opening and heartbreaking and deeply uncomfortable. I am putting this pebble in my shoe because given what I have learned, I am not willing to go back to being comfortable. I want this physical discomfort to remind me of my soul's disquiet, which I regard as holy." This holy disquiet is not an easy practice, but it brings us into the light of our second core truth, which declares the wholeness of every single person. This is a radical teaching. It is a radical remembrance that there is no human life inherently of more value than another, and therefore that there is no person who is disposable, who can be thrown away. It challenges, therefore, the categories and the labels that human beings use so easily to diminish one another and to separate ourselves into small circles of those we define as us. If every person is inherently of worth, then each person is worthy of inclusion. Inclusion is a soul-enlarging practice. When we start to see and to challenge the barriers that exist in our own minds and imaginations that are born of fear or habit or by plain old ignorance, the space in which we can then begin to move becomes more ample. We breathe an easier air of connection and companionship. We begin to really hear the stories that are told in other voices, catch a glimpse of reality as it is seen through other eyes, and our understanding expands. The times through which we are now living are in urgent need of this embracing practice. The capacity that we have to see and recognize kin across multiple barriers is one deeply inherent to being human. We can see this because of millions of examples throughout our history that shine, some of them grand and public gestures and some of them anonymous. The person who runs into a burning building to save a complete stranger. The one who devotes her entire life working against an injustice that never fell directly on her. The capacity to see kinship is inherent in us. And yet it is matched or even exceeded by our capacity to embrace enthusiastically all forms of division. This capacity is also bred at the bone. We are easily frightened, and our fear can drive us to extremes. Fear is being used as a tool of division in the politics of our nation to a greater degree than I have ever witnessed in my lifetime. It has been used, it continues to be used, to other fellow human beings into categories that can be reacted against and rejected. Immigrants, Muslims, felons, Mexicans, activists, journalists. And lest we feel the stirrings of self-righteousness, let us remember that those of us who tend to place ourselves on the left side of the aisle are just as capable of this practice. We willingly other and diminish those we label as the alt-right, Trump supporters, evangelical Christians, Tea Party activists, sometimes just Republicans. Of course, we should continue to passionately oppose laws or policies that diminish other people or make a god out of profit. But our willingness to make the opposition, to make other people into two-dimensional enemies, is a kind of tribalism driven by fear. And each one of us carries that impulse within us. It is part of being human. Our world has always been an uncertain place with its share of dangers, and we each know what it can feel like to tremble as the world tilts and changes around us. But we get to choose what our response will be. We get to choose between the closing in of tribalism and the opening out of connection. And it is that latter that our faith calls us to connection. The third truth that I believe is core to us as Unitarian Universalists is that we are all works in progress, or as I said it in the workshop yesterday, we are all half-baked. We are not yet the human beings we aspire to be. We are flawed and we stumble. We hurt one another and we fail. And the great religious truth lifted up by our Universalist ancestors is that the proper response to those flaws and failings is not damnation and hell. It is change, course correction, and forgiveness. To recognize and to bow to the reality that we are works in progress, that we are all flawed, brings in its wake some therefore clauses. Therefore, we should practice grace rather than defensiveness when we make mistakes, since making mistakes quite literally comes with the territory of being human. Therefore, we must engage in forgiveness of others' failings, since we ourselves will so often need to ask for it. Therefore, each person, no matter how terrible the crime, is redeemable. And therefore, we are called, we are challenged to engage in the kind of attentive, deep looking that allows us to see our own shadows, especially when we're about the work of justice. Think for a moment about the words in that grand old hymn that some of you may not have sung since your Methodist days, God of grace and God of glory. So often the songs we sing that have to do with our work in the world and our justice work are filled with this kind of ready confidence that we're the good guys and we're charging out there to save things and to make it all better. And they can be very inspirational. They can be terrific songs. But listen to what a different feeling and ethos even is evoked from these words that Harry Emerson Fosdick wrote almost a century ago. Cure thy children's warring madness, bend our pride to thy control, shame our wanton selfish gladness, rich in things and poor in soul. Cure our madness, bend our pride, shame our selfishness, heal our wounds, and then grant us wisdom and courage. Our faith calls us to a spiritual honesty, mindful that the things we so want to change out there in an unjust world also exist in here, in some form. Our work in trying to change the world cannot be teased apart from our need ourselves to continue to change, to continue to grow. Our Unitarian Universalism has always been focused on this life and this world, calling us toward action to mend the torn places as well as we are able. But this faith of ours calls us not only toward what we are to do, but also toward who we are to be. We are called not only to be people of action, but people of attention, willing to awaken, willing to be reminded of our kinship, willing to remember what we really want to mean. There's a marvelous Jewish proverb that teaches a human life is like a single letter of the alphabet. It can mean little, or it can be part of a great meaning. May we join our lives to being part of a great meaning. Amen.